Hello, thank you for joining me on Humanities Radio. I'm Jana Cunningham with the University of Utah College of Humanities, and today we're talking about Black History Month, its origin, its purpose, and why Black history is American history. Eric Herschthal, Assistant Professor of History, is with me to discuss more. So each February, we celebrate Black History Month. So let's just begin with the origins of Black History Month. When and how did it begin?
Absolutely. The month actually has a wonderful history, a really powerful history, and it begins with, generally we start with one individual in particular, though it was quickly sort of embraced and took a life of its own within Black communities. But that one person is Carter G. Woodson. He was the second African American to earn a PhD after his more famous colleague W.E.B. Du Bois. A PhD in history from Harvard, the second Black American to earn that degree. And he gets his PhD in 1912, and 3 years later, the African American community. Keep in mind, this is roughly a half century, not 50 years after the end of slavery. So already for 50 odd years, within Black communities across the nation, there had been celebrations of the end of emancipation, usually in February. Again, it was a very grassroots thing. And it was February, these emancipation holidays, because that was the birthday of both Abraham Lincoln, the president who famously was sort of instrumental in emancipation, as well as Frederick Douglass. Anyway, so he's at one of these sort of celebrations of sort of Black intellectuals and family and friends in Chicago. And he has the idea to create a kind of more rigorous scientific study or intellectual community to study Black history, to make it not simply a community event. He goes on to found what is today the most prominent organization for the academic study of Black history, or African American history more specifically. It's called the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH. And it's this organization that's founded, I believe it's in 1916. And then within a decade, he finally gets, part of that was to get kind of Black scholars who were, of course, for the most part, denied access to teaching in white universities because of Jim Crow. But this was going to be a kind of separate institution that Black people and Black intellectuals were going to use to sort of legitimate Black history with as many sort of trained or even untrained Black historians. So this ASALH organization, still alive today, the publisher of the premier Journal of African American History. By 1926, they established a Black History Week. It was actually called Negro Achievement Week. And the basic principle was pretty simple, and in a way, what Black history today still, at least in part, is about, which is to say, giving Black children and Black adult continuing learners an opportunity to learn their own history in a way that isn't demeaning or simply ignored in mainstream institutions. But over the course of, this is 1926, right? This is the Harlem Renaissance. There's a sort of explosion of Black people moving to the North and all this cultural creativity. And this holiday quickly explodes. And it's really a grassroots holiday. And very quickly, ASALH, the organization that he founds, with the help by the 1930s of a famous Black woman educator, Mary McLeod Bethune, they begin to sort of print popular materials so that anybody, even not PhD or college level, can really teach Black history to children as a kind of empowering story. And then the real end of it, the kind of modern iteration, and this is where I'll end it, is, Woodson dies in 1950. But of course, the civil rights movement explodes, becomes a kind of street-oriented protest in the 1950s. There's all this sort of, Black consciousness. By the end of the 60s, we're having a kind of Black power, a more kind of defiant, militant, and sort of prideful Black activist movement. And all of a sudden, there's calls to expand it. Black student activists on campus expanded to a month. And then finally, ASALH, this organization, is instrumental in pushing actually the Ford, a Republican, Nixon's successor, to sort of issue a formal proclamation to just honor. It's not an official holiday, but just to formally honor a proclamation this Black History Month. And every single president since Ford, Republican and Republican and Democrat, has sort of issued a formal proclamation honoring February as the month of Black History Month.
So, since the beginning of, with the Black History Week, now that it's Black History Month, how has the observance of Black History Month changed? I imagine, as you had mentioned, the Civil Rights Movement, there has been so much change in our country. How have historians and teachers approached incorporating Black history, Black experience into history courses? Because I imagine it's just constantly changing. And how are they incorporating it now?
Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful question. There isn't any single answer. To my knowledge, there isn't much extensive study on Black History Month, at least from the scholarship that I know, in a kind of, tracing at what you're asking, change over time. But there certainly is, thinking about this question, a pattern that even Carter G. Woodson, he witnessed 25 years of it. He dies in 1950. He was very aware that as Black communities were sort of taking hold of this holiday and making it their own across the country, he's worried that, there are many charlatans, that he would call it, people who are basically cashing in, don't really know anything. Black teachers are asking, keep in mind, for the most part, North and South, right? Segregation was legal in the South, but it was de facto in the North. And, so many Black, predominantly, overwhelmingly Black schools, Black teachers are taking it upon themselves to kind of use this month to sort of highlight Black figures, Black leaders throughout American history. And of course, there were charlatans, people who didn't really know much, who were kind of self-stylized experts. And this speaks more broadly to a kind of commercialization of the holiday. This was something that happened during Carter Woodson. He wanted to root it out. That's why with Mary McLeod Bethune, a Black woman educator, they kind of issue a SALA, a formal popular kind of bulletin every year, that if you want to do it the way a SALA wants you to do it, then these are the themes and these are some things to discuss with your students or children or what have you. And that, of course, we're still seeing today. You can listen to any, there's this concern that, either it's almost too popular. You can hear, if you're listening to podcasts or radio hosts or talking to your Black, friends or even family members, this sense in which it's kind of gone beyond the Black community and sort of, rhetorically everybody pays lip service to it. But it ceases to be a sort of central element of Black families. Of course, it is a central element of many Black families, and Black communities still very much embrace it. But it's this kind of commercialization that is maybe one of the negative sides, this way in which it's moved beyond the Black community and becomes something that everybody just kind of, again, pays deference to. But maybe I'll just answer and just one other point about the change. And I think, amongst people, maybe the best way is, there are many wonderful high school and even middle school teachers, to say nothing of educated parents, librarians, who keep abreast of really good scholarship that isn't locked up in journals, but, scholars who write for the public. And there's no shortage of that today. And one of the major really shifts, I guess what I'm saying, in how academics talk about Black history is in the 1970s. And that is to say, in the wake, on the heels, or really as the Black Power movement and this kind of more militant, defiant tone is being defined, many scholar activists, and I'm thinking of one in particular, Vincent Harding, says, we need to stop telling Black history. He's speaking in Atlanta to a kind of international, activist scholarship symposium. Vincent Harding, who is an ally of MLK, a little bit more radical than MLK. And he's basically saying, look, we need to stop teaching Black history, not Black History Month, but it's simply how we talk about Black history as simply a contributionist history, which is how the old scholars did it, show Black people that they too can be great, that they too can contribute to this American story. And rather, what Vincent Harding is arguing for in the symposium is saying we need to sort of not simply put more Black faces into an unchanged, basically good American story. We need to make sure that Black history ultimately challenges the story of American history. This idea that it has always been innocent, that it has always been, or at least sort of overcoming its better angels, and really the proper Black history, if it's doing itself properly, if it's done properly, according to Harding, is, again, it should challenge, it should expose some of the flaws and weaknesses, and use that ultimately not to deny that America is necessarily a good or evil thing, but really to sort of hold its feet to the fire a little bit. And I think this is a shift that we see. Again, there are many scholars and journalists who write, kind of just positive pieces about the first Black astronaut, and that's all well and good. But I think the mission of African American history, and it's not the only one, has also been to really challenge some of these founding ideals, and perhaps even to show how it was Black activists, Black communities themselves who have really reshaped and redefined, the meaning of American democracy, the meaning of citizenship, rather than simply, another face who contributed to an essentially, implicitly white European story.
So that's actually something I would like to elaborate on just a little bit. Because one point I really want to discuss is that, we can't fully understand the complex history of this country without including the Black perspective. Black history is American history. And like you said, we have to incorporate them together to tell a more holistic story of our country and a more real story of our country. So how can it be better integrated into everyday learning to create that more holistic understanding especially for students as they're going through school?
Again, I teach at the college level, so I really wouldn't, I'm wary of kind of imposing how even a high school, which is not that different from, an entry level college course, is probably teaching history. So I'm wary. I mean, I'll leave it up to the much more skilled, high school K through 12 to decide how they implement these changes. Although there are, and I know wonderful resources available. In terms of, how to incorporate. There's a wonderful series. I'll just maybe a little plug. What's it called? I'm blocking on the organization, but it's a series of podcasts and a website called Hard History. It's edited by an African-American historian at OSU, Hassan Jeffries. And it's all about, it's podcast scholars teaching how to teach these hard subjects, whether it's the civil rights movement or really more challenging, the Black Power movement. Or certainly slavery, and how to incorporate. So that's a wonderful resource that teachers can use. It's cutting edge. It's wonderful, and it's geared towards public educators, K through 12, and even college. But more specifically, how can we integrate? I think the key thing, and I actually got this from a scholar of mine, just the way that she phrased it. She was talking about gender history, but I think it's broadly true for Black history or any kind of marginalized group in kind of a standard or traditional version of American history. And that is to say, don't carve off Black history as one week in a syllabus. Right? Let's say you're teaching, the U.S. History Survey, a high school course on history, right? You don't carve off, a Black, 1 week for the Black experience, but throughout the course, you're thinking about how is this affecting, and more importantly, how are Black communities in all their diversity responding? And there is, so in other words, what are the, classic sort of keywords in American history? Democracy, freedom, citizenship, right? So any course, if you're tracing how the idea of democracy changes over time from the founding, let's say, to the present, throughout, if that's the kind of through line that you're going to track, well, throughout, you would be wanting to look at, not only, white people, but rich and poor, male and female, Black people, also women and female, upper class versus recently, or, there is a free Black community, which would be, an upper class, as well as poor Black people. So you sort of are conscientious throughout the entire narrative of your broader telling to be thinking about how Black people are both affected by and contributing or challenging these ideals. And of course, we should do that across communities, right? About major problems that we have in our society in terms of how we don't deal with them, which is to say, Latino groups, gender inequality, class exploitation, We not and even just simple ideological difference, conservative and liberal. I think a good teacher is conscientious of these divisions and really has to work and find space for them throughout all the kind of development of their courses, not pigeonhole it for a week or even a month.
So as you're teaching college students, when they arrive into your course, are there stories, lessons or critical lessons that they have missed out on, and you're surprised when they come into your course and when they come into college that they haven't learned in school yet?
It's a great question, and I can't, I think there's a general assumption, and this may be amongst faculty who are slightly older and haven't been as connected to how education is happening now. I mean, I'm not terribly old, but I can tell you that, and this is a Utah, which is, has a reputation. I mean, it is a conservative state, but even then, I am not, the narrative that slavery was central to American history, that was negative, that the country was, the elimination in one way or another of indigenous people. I mean, this is not a surprise to them. But it's a superficial story, right? And it's often, I should also say, a story of what was done to these communities rather than what these communities themselves have done for themselves and unquestionably with their allies, with their white allies in particular. So for example, we can talk about, let's say, I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. I'll just use that as a principle, and then maybe as one example, a really useful and in these days not terribly novel, and that is even approaching these traditional topics when you are dealing with the 1960s and the civil rights movement, right? So we all know Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, but in the past decade, at the very least, there have been wonderful changes. I mean, scholars have been pushing back about focusing on what some historians call the grass tops versus the grassroots. By grass tops, I mean leaders of social movements like Martin Luther King. And instead, there's been a push since at least the 80s to focus on, ground level organizing, all the faces that you never saw, that never were called before Congress. So there's that. And again, much books about this. But the other thing, there are two other things. One is to show that, look, the civil rights movement wasn't this little bitty phase from the 50s to the 60s. This was part of a larger story of Black resistance that, depending on how far back you go, starts at least in the 1920s. Let's start with the Harlem Renaissance and this kind of, this assertion of Black equality, trying to challenge even in the North racial discrimination. And it is much longer than the story of Brown v. Board and the marches in the 1960s. And related to that is this idea that we shouldn't simply be talking about the civil rights movement, but to understand even how that language, the civil rights movement, became the language. And this is actually an interesting little story, and that is to say, the civil rights movement was an attempt by more moderate Black leaders in the 1950s to really reframe what had been a diverse, expansive, and radical. By that I mean allying with, the overthrow of European colonialism. Some Black people allying with communism in the late 1920s and early 1930s. But because, America after the war is fighting, immediately enters this Cold War where communism is bad and, you don't tax American ideals, all of a sudden Black moderate leaders, mainly in the more moderate organization, the NAACP, say, hey, we need to reframe our struggle and only focus it around American ideals of civil rights. And more importantly, only target the most egregious form of anti-democratic practice, which is legal segregation in the South. This is, of course, very different from what Black activists, and we will see it bubble up as soon as the major desegregation laws are passed in the mid-1960s, that the Black freedom struggle, we would say, is pushed all the way to the North immediately. That is to say, they are fighting the less obvious forms of discrimination in terms of housing discrimination, job employment, economic equality. And Black people, of course, never really disassociated all these forms of discrimination, but it became a very, politically useful to narrow the focus onto legal segregation in the midst of a Cold War where America didn't want to look bad. So, even knowing why we talk about, a civil rights movement and not the Black freedom struggle is itself kind of a telling little story.
Eric, I really appreciate your time on this thoughtful conversation today. It's incredibly important. I'm sure people have really learned a lot. Before we move on, can you tell our listeners what courses you teach?
Absolutely. So currently I'm teaching my specialty, as it relates to African American history, is the history of slavery and abolition. So of course, you next in the coming academic year, I'll be teaching at least one, possibly two courses on the history of slavery, and another course that I will likely be teaching next year. My next project that I'm just getting started is about slavery and the origins of climate change. So I'll be teaching an upper level course, a history of race and the environment, which will deal not exclusively with Black people's engagement with the environment, but Black people will have a large part to play in that course. And I should say that all of my courses, my U.S. History Survey, as well as History 1700, Black people and the Black experience is a central part of that general American history.
That was Eric Herschthal, Assistant Professor of History. For more information about the College of Humanities, please visit humanities.utah.edu.